In the depths of an unforgiving winter storm, a mysterious knock echoes through an empty repair shop. Behind that door stands a woman with a shocking secret, and a young mechanic whose decision to work late will unravel a series of events that neither fate nor coincidence could have predicted. Some say guardian angels appear when we least expect them, but on this night in Everbrook Valley, both Finn Hawthorne and Iris Winters would discover that sometimes saving a life means finding your own reason to live. If you're ready to experience a story that will touch your heart and remind you that miracles happen in the most unexpected places, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us bring more incredible true stories to life. Now let's begin this extraordinary tale. The ancient overhead lights of Hawthorne Motors Repair cast long shadows across the weathered concrete floor, their gentle hum mixing with the whisper of snow against windows that hadn't been replaced since Finn's Uncle Reed first opened the shop 30 years ago. Outside, the Appalachian Mountains loomed like silent guardians, their peaks lost in a darkness that seemed to swallow even the brightest stars on this moonless December night. Finn Hawthorne stood at his workbench, his calloused hands moving with practiced precision over the engine parts spread before him. The scar above his right eyebrow, a reminder of his first attempt to help his uncle fix a car at age 8, caught the light as he leaned closer to examine a timing belt. At 32, he'd grown into the kind of mechanic people trusted with their lives, though few knew the weight of solitude he carried beneath his quiet competence. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., its tired hands marking time in a shop that should have been closed hours ago. But Finn had his reasons for staying. The approaching holiday season always brought an influx of travelers through Everbrook Valley, and with them came vehicles unprepared for the mountain's cruel winter demands. Tonight, he had 3 cars that needed to be ready by morning, tourists who'd planned their Christmas vacations without considering the treachery of Pine Ridge Road in December. The radio crackled with static before the weather announcer's voice cut through. Extreme weather warning for Everbrook Valley and surrounding areas. Temperatures expected to drop to 15 below zero overnight. Heavy snowfall continuing through. Finn reached over and turned it off, preferring the honest sound of his tools against metal to the grim forecasts he'd been hearing all day. Through the front windows, he watched as the snow fell in thick curtains, transforming Pine Ridge Road into a ghostly river of white. The wind had picked up, carrying with it that hollow moan that locals said was the mountain sharing its secrets. Finn knew better. He'd grown up learning the mountain's true language, the way ice formed in shadowed corners, how snow packed differently at various elevations, which roads became death traps when the temperature dropped just so. At the Warm Hearth Diner earlier that day, Luna Chen had warned him about the storm while sliding his usual black coffee across the counter. "Mark my words, Finn Hawthorne," she'd said, her eyes carrying that knowing look he'd learned not to question. "Tonight's the kind of night that changes lives." He'd smiled politely then, but now as the storm intensified and the old building creaked under winter's assault, her words echoed in his mind with an unsettling resonance. Finn moved to the small office area, where a collection of photographs hung on the wall, memories preserved under a layer of dust. There was one of him and Uncle Reed on opening day, after Finn had officially joined the business, both of them grinning beneath the fresh-painted Hawthorne Motors sign. Next to it, a more recent photo showed him receiving the Valley's Business Excellence Award, though he'd nearly skipped the ceremony, uncomfortable with the attention it brought. The heat from the ancient radiator fought a losing battle against the cold seeping through every crack and crevice of the old building. Finn pulled his heavy work jacket tighter and glanced at his phone. No signal, as usual during storms this severe. He'd intended to head home hours ago to his small cabin up on Evergreen Trail, but something had kept him here. Maybe it was the cars that needed finishing, or maybe it was that peculiar sixth sense mechanics developed after years of working in these mountains. The one that told you when someone might need help on a night like this. The tools in his hands were more than instruments of his trade. They were extensions of a legacy passed down through generations of mountain folk who understood that survival here meant looking out for one another. Each wrench, each socket, each well-worn screwdriver told a story of broken-down cars and stranded travelers who'd found their way to Hawthorne Motors over the years. A sudden gust of wind rattled the building's bones, and for a moment, the lights flickered ominously. Finn held his breath, knowing that if the power went out, the backup generator would kick in, but it would mean working by the dim emergency lights, never ideal for the precise work he was doing. The light steadied, and he exhaled slowly, returning his attention to the timing belt replacement that had kept him here so late. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that in less than 15 minutes, a knock at his door would shatter the routine of this long night. That knock would belong to a woman named Iris Winters, and her arrival would set in motion events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fate, trust, and the true meaning of being someone's lifeline on a cold winter night. The steady drip of melting snow from his boots echoed through the workshop as Finn made his way to the small break room he'd built last summer. It wasn't much, just a corner carved out of the sprawling garage with a mini-fridge, a worn leather armchair salvaged from his uncle's house, and a collection of technical manuals that had survived 3 decades of coffee stains and greasy fingerprints. But it was here, in this modest space, that Finn spent most of his waking hours, finding solace in the familiar smell of motor oil and the distant howl of mountain winds. At 32, Finn Hawthorne had already lived several lifetimes' worth of experiences, each one etched into the calluses on his hands and the quiet determination in his eyes. He'd inherited the shop 5 years ago when Uncle Reed's arthritis had finally forced him to retire, though inherited wasn't quite the right word. Reed had made him earn it, starting from the bottom when Finn was just 18, fresh out of high school and carrying nothing but a duffel bag and broken dreams of a baseball scholarship that had shattered along with his shoulder in his final high school game. The memory of that day still visited him sometimes, especially on nights like this when the cold made his old injury ache. He'd been the star pitcher for Everbrook High, with scouts from 3 different colleges in the stands. One wild pitch, one wrong landing, and his future had spun off its axis. But Uncle Reed had been there that day, and later at the hospital, he'd offered Finn something more valuable than a scholarship. He'd offered him purpose. Finn pulled a thermos from the mini-fridge, Luna's special blend of coffee that she insisted on sending home with him every evening. "A mechanic running on empty can't help anybody," she'd say, her wise eyes seeing more than she let on. The coffee was still warm, and as he took a sip, his gaze fell on the framed certificate hanging crookedly on the wall. His master mechanic certification, earned through 4 years of grueling study and apprenticeship while working full-time at the shop. The certification wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a testament to the long nights he'd spent hunched over textbooks, grease-stained fingers tracing diagrams of engine components, while other guys his age were outliving what his mother used to call a normal life. But normal had never been in the cards for Finn, not after his father walked out when he was 12, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note and a lifetime of trust issues. Not after watching his mother work 3 jobs to keep their little family afloat until Uncle Reed had stepped in to help. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, drawing Finn's attention to the storm outside. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes illuminated by the shop's exterior lights like falling stars. He checked his phone again. Still no signal. On nights like this, Everbrook Valley became an island, cut off from the outside world by nature's fury. It was why he kept the shop open late during storms, why he stocked the small storage room with emergency supplies, why he never turned away a stranded traveler no matter the hour. The locals called him dedicated. The tourists called him a godsend. But few understood that his long hours and relentless work ethic weren't just about helping others. They were his shield against the crushing weight of solitude that threatened to overwhelm him in quiet moments. At 32, he'd watched as friends married, started families, moved away to bigger cities with brighter lights. Meanwhile, he'd poured himself into every broken engine, every worn brake pad, every suspicious rattle that found its way into his shop. His uncle had tried to talk to him about it last Sunday during their weekly dinner. "You can't fix everybody's problems, Finn," Reed had said, his arthritic hands wrapped around a mug of decaf. "Sometimes you have to let people figure things out for themselves." But Finn had just smiled and changed the subject to the new diagnostic equipment he was thinking of buying. He wasn't ready to admit that maybe his uncle was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Right? that maybe his need to fix everything stemmed from his own unresolved wounds. The wall calendar caught his eye. December 23rd circled in red ink. 2 days until Christmas, and the only decoration in the shop was a small wreath Luna had hung on the door last week, insisting that even a confirmed bachelor like him needed some holiday spirit. He hadn't had the heart to take it down, just like he hadn't had the heart to decline her invitation to Christmas dinner. "Nobody should be alone on Christmas," she'd declared, in that tone that brooked no argument. Finn set down his coffee and walked back to the workbench, where the timing belt replacement still waited. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, muscle memory built through thousands of similar repairs. But his mind wandered to the small box hidden in his office desk drawer, a retirement gift for Uncle Reed that he'd been working on for months, restoring the vintage pocket watch that had belonged to Reed's father. It was the kind of detailed work he excelled at, each tiny gear and spring a puzzle to be solved, each piece fitting perfectly into its prescribed place. If only life were that simple, that predictable. If only human relationships could be diagnosed and repaired with the same methodical precision as engines. But Finn had learned the hard way that people weren't machines. They couldn't be fixed with tools and spare parts, couldn't be trusted to follow the laws of mechanics and physics. People left. People lied. People broke promises. Cars, at least, had the decency to warn you when something was wrong, to give you a chance to fix the problem before it became catastrophic. The clock ticked past midnight, marking the beginning of Christmas Eve. In a few hours, the morning would bring a steady stream of holiday travelers, each with their own urgent problems and desperate pleas. Finn would help them all, would send them safely on their way with repaired vehicles and grateful smiles. But for now, in these quiet hours between night and dawn, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his chosen solitude, to acknowledge the empty spaces in his life that no amount of work could fill. What he didn't realize as he stood there, surrounded by the familiar tools of his trade, was that fate, or perhaps just the cruel geography of mountain roads in winter, was about to send him a different kind of problem to solve. One that wouldn't be fixed with wrenches and wire diagrams. One that would challenge everything he thought he knew about helping others and healing himself. The first sign that this night would be different came not with a bang or a crash, but with the subtle flickering of the shop's fluorescent lights. Finn glanced up from the timing belt he'd been working on, his trained ear catching the distant groan of transformers struggling against the storm's fury. The backup generator was ready. He'd checked it just yesterday. But something about this particular power fluctuation sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures outside. Through the shop's frost-etched windows, the world had transformed into a canvas of swirling white. The storm that weather services had been tracking for days had finally arrived in full force, turning Pine Ridge Road into nothing more than a suggestion beneath feet of accumulated snow. The wind howled through the valley with a voice that seemed almost human, carrying with it the kind of cold that could kill within minutes of exposure. Finn wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked to the ancient radio mounted near his tool chest. The emergency broadcast system had been active all evening, but now the warnings took on a more urgent tone. Multiple accidents reported on Highway 23. Emergency services are overwhelmed. All residents are urged to stay indoors. Repeat, this is a life-threatening situation. Do not attempt to travel. The static-filled voice faded into white noise as Finn's attention was drawn to a sound he'd never heard before in all his years at the shop. A deep, resonant cracking that seemed to come from the very mountains themselves. He moved to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass to peer into the darkness. In the cone of light cast by the shop's exterior lamps, he could see the massive pine trees at the edge of the property bending at dangerous angles, their branches heavy with ice and snow. "Come on, hold together," he muttered, though whether he was talking to the trees, the power lines, or his own resolve, he wasn't quite sure. The shop had weathered countless storms over the decades, but something about this one felt different. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if nature herself was holding her breath, waiting for something to happen. The timing belt repair lay forgotten on his workbench as Finn began his storm preparations in earnest. He'd done this routine so many times it was almost muscle memory. checking the emergency supplies, ensuring the first aid kit was fully stocked, testing the backup generator one more time. Uncle Reed's voice echoed in his head. "In these mountains, son, being prepared isn't just about keeping yourself safe, it's about being ready to help others when they need it most." As if summoned by the thought, his phone buzzed with a text message, the first signal it had managed to catch in hours. It was from Luna. "Power's out at the diner. Roads are impossible. Stay safe, Finn. Something tells me someone might need that light of yours tonight." Luna's messages always seemed to carry a weight beyond their simple words. In the 14 years he'd known her, she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when trouble was brewing. Finn had learned to take her hunches seriously, even if he'd never admitted out loud. He texted back a quick, "You too," before the signal died again, leaving him once more isolated in his island of light and warmth. The shop's heaters worked overtime against the deepening cold, their steady hum a counterpoint to the storm's chaos. Finn found himself checking his supplies again. Blankets, emergency flares, basic medical supplies. The satellite phone Uncle Reed had insisted he keep for situations exactly like this. The clock on the wall ticked past 12:30 a.m., each second marked by the steady drip of melting snow from his boots. The 3 cars he'd been working on stood like silent sentinels in their bays. Mrs. Thompson's Subaru with its troublesome timing belt, the Martinez family's minivan waiting for new brake pads, and a tourist's BMW that needed its transmission fluid changed. All of them had to be ready by morning, but something kept Finn from focusing on the work. Instead, he found himself drawn back to the windows, watching the hypnotic dance of snowflakes in the harsh glow of the security lights. The storm had created a strange sort of twilight world, where distance and perspective played tricks on the eyes. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the boundary between earth and sky had disappeared entirely. A sudden movement caught his eye. Something dark against the endless white, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. Finn squinted into the darkness, his hand instinctively reaching for the powerful flashlight he kept in his back pocket. Years of mountain living had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every nerve in his body was on high alert. The radio crackled back to life, making him jump. Multiple vehicles reported stranded on Pine Ridge Road. Emergency services are currently unable to reach. Temperatures continuing to drop. Wind chill advisory in effect. Finn's jaw tightened as he processed this information. Pine Ridge Road was less than a quarter mile from his shop, and he knew every treacherous curve of it. In weather like this, that road became a death trap, its steep grades and sharp turns transforming into a gauntlet that even the most experienced drivers struggled to navigate. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and Finn held his breath until they stabilized. In that brief moment of near darkness, he could have sworn he heard something, a sound distinct from the storm's constant roar. He stood perfectly still, straining to hear past the wind and the hum of machinery. There it was again. A faint metallic sound like someone trying to start a dead engine carried on the wind from somewhere out in the darkness. Finn's heart rate quickened. He knew that sound, had heard it countless times before, the desperate, futile attempt of a frozen engine to turn over. Without conscious thought, his hands began gathering supplies, jumper cables, tools, the emergency kit he kept ready for exactly this kind of situation. The rational part of his mind argued against going out in this weather, reminded him of the emergency broadcast's warnings. But deeper than rationality, stronger than self-preservation, was the knowledge that someone out there needed help. The wind's howl rose to a crescendo as Finn reached for his heavy winter coat, and in that moment, fate, or perhaps just the cruel mathematics of chance and circumstance, decided to show its hand. The shop's lights went out all at once, plunging everything into total darkness for the 3 seconds it took the backup generator to kick in. And in those 3 seconds of perfect darkness, Finn heard it. 3 sharp, desperate knocks on the shop's front door. The sound seemed to hang in the air even after the emergency lights sputtered to life, casting their dim glow across the workshop. Finn stood frozen, his coat half on, as the knocks came again. More urgent this time, more desperate. Whatever he had been preparing for, whatever he had expected this night to bring, He knew with sudden certainty that opening that door would change everything. The emergency lights cast long, uncertain shadows across the workshop floor as Finn approached the door, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet between wind gusts. Years of mountain living had taught him caution, especially on nights like this when desperation could drive people to do unthinkable things. He'd heard enough stories from the old-timers about stranded travelers who turned out to be something else entirely. Through the frost-covered window beside the door, he could make out a silhouette, a single figure hunched against the storm. The security light above the door flickered, making the shadow dance eerily against the curtain of swirling snow. Finn's hand hesitated on the door handle, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The response was nearly lost in a gust of wind. A woman's voice, brittle with cold and fear. "Please, me, we're at my car. I need help." The voice cracked on the last word, and something in its raw desperation cut through Finn's practiced caution. Still, Uncle Reed's words echoed in his mind. "Trust your gut, but verify your facts." He reached for the exterior light switch, flooding the front of the shop with harsh fluorescent clarity. The woman flinched at the sudden brightness, raising a hand to shield her eyes. In that moment, Finn took in every detail with the precision he usually reserved for diagnosing engine problems. She was well-dressed, expensive coat, though not meant for mountain weather, and probably in her mid-50s. Her silver-streaked hair had come partially loose from what had once been an elegant updo, and she was shivering violently, her lips taking on the bluish tinge that every mountain resident knew to fear. But it was her eyes that made his decision for him, wide with fear but clear and direct, meeting his gaze through the window with a dignity that spoke of someone unused to asking for help. No hint of deception, just pure, unvarnished need. The lock clicked open under his hand before he'd consciously decided to turn it. The wind caught the door, nearly yanking it from his grip as he pulled it open. A blast of Arctic air invaded the shop, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the kind of cold that burned. "Get in," he said, having to raise his voice over the storm. "Quickly." The woman stumbled forward, her movements stiff with cold. Finn caught her arm as she crossed the threshold, steadying her as he pushed the door closed against the wind. Up close, he could see she was wearing high-heeled boots, entirely unsuitable for these conditions. "I'm Iris," she managed through chattering teeth. "Iris Winters." The irony of her name might have been amusing under different circumstances. "Finn Hawthorne," he responded automatically, already guiding her toward the break room where the spare heater was running. "What happened?" "Where's your car?" About half a mile back," she said, her words coming in short bursts between shivers. "On Pine Ridge Road. I hit something. A patch of ice, maybe. Spun out into a snowbank. The engine. It just died." She closed her eyes briefly, swaying slightly. "I tried to call for help, but there's no signal. I saw your lights." Finn helped her into the old leather armchair, quickly grabbing the emergency blanket from his supply kit. As he wrapped it around her shoulders, he noticed her hands, elegant, with a writer's callus on one finger, but alarmingly cold. Possible frostbite. The rational part of his mind was already calculating how long she must have been exposed to the elements, factoring in the wind chill and dropping temperatures. "How long were you walking?" he asked, moving to the mini-fridge for a bottle of water. She needed to warm up, but slowly, safely. "I'm not sure. 20 minutes? 30? It was hard to tell in the storm. Everything looked the same." Her voice was steadier now, but Finn didn't miss the underlying tremor of shock. The radio crackled in the background. "Temperature now at 18 below zero with wind chill reaching dangerous levels. All emergency services are currently delayed. Residents are advised to shelter in place." Finn's mind raced through scenarios and options. The woman, Iris, needed medical attention. Even if she didn't have frostbite, prolonged exposure to these temperatures could have serious consequences. But the roads were treacherous, emergency services were overwhelmed, and the hospital was a good 40-minute drive even in perfect conditions. "Ms. Winters," he said, crouching down to her eye level, "I need you to be honest with me. Besides the cold, are you injured? Any chest pain? Difficulty breathing? She shook her head, clutching the blanket tighter. Just cold and scared, she admitted, that same dignity in her voice despite the confession. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the building's frame, making them both jump. The emergency lights flickered ominously, reminding Finn that even his well-prepared shop was vulnerable to the storm's fury. He needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it now. Option 1. Keep her here, warm and safe, until morning or until emergency services became available. The logical choice, the cautious choice. Option 2. Try to reach her car, assess the damage, possibly get it running again. Risky, but if successful, it would mean she could get to proper shelter, proper medical care if needed. As if reading his thoughts, Iris spoke up. My medication. It's in the car. I didn't think to grab it. I panicked when the engine died. She met his eyes directly. It's not immediately critical, but I'll need it by morning. And there it was, the detail that transformed this from a simple choice into a moral imperative. Finn straightened up, his decision made. He knew these mountains, knew this weather, knew exactly what could go wrong out there in the darkness. He also knew he couldn't live with himself if something happened to this woman because he chose the safer option. I'm going to get your car, he said, already moving to gather his heavy weather gear. You'll stay here where it's warm. The generator has enough fuel to last days if needed, and there are supplies in that cabinet. He pointed to the emergency stockpile. If anyone else comes, do not open the door. If the power goes out completely, there are flashlights in the top drawer. Iris started to protest, but Finn cut her off gently. Ms. Winters, I've lived in these mountains my whole life. I know what I'm doing, and I know that car needs to be recovered before it's completely buried or damaged by the cold. Plus, he added with a slight smile, you need your medication, and I'm not in the habit of leaving jobs half-finished. As he pulled on his heavy boots and checked his emergency kit, Finn was acutely aware that this could be a terrible mistake. The storm was getting worse, visibility was near zero, and every warning system in the valley was screaming at people to stay inside. But some decisions aren't made with logic alone. Sometimes the right choice is the one that scares you the most. He packed quickly and efficiently. Tow ropes, jumper cables, first aid kit, emergency flares, his satellite phone. Each item was a defense against the 1,000 things that could go wrong out there in the storm. As he zipped up his heavy winter coat, he caught Iris watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between gratitude and concern. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Finn paused at the door, considering her question. The easy answer would be professional responsibility or mountain hospitality. But the truth was something else entirely, something about second chances and fate and lights in the darkness. Because someone once helped me when I needed it, he said finally. And they didn't know me either. With that, he opened the door, letting in a blast of Arctic air and swirling snow. The last thing he saw before stepping out into the storm was Iris's reflection in the window, backlit by the emergency lights, watching him disappear into the whiteout with the same mix of hope and fear he felt in his own heart. The moment Finn stepped outside, the storm hit him like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind cut through his heavy winter gear as if it were made of paper. His breath crystallized instantly, forming ice crystals in his beard. The security lights around the shop created a small island of visibility, but beyond their reach, the darkness was absolute. A void filled with swirling snow and ancient mountain shadows. He'd grabbed his most powerful flashlight, but its beam seemed to bounce off the wall of snowflakes, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made it difficult to maintain his sense of direction. Pine Ridge Road lay somewhere ahead, but in these conditions, even familiar landmarks became treacherous mirages. Half a mile back, he muttered to himself, mentally mapping the road. At her walking pace in these conditions, that could put the car anywhere between the Devil's Curve and Old Miller's Creek. Both spots were notorious for accidents, especially in weather like this. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sound that made Finn's blood run cold. The distant, haunting cry of a mountain lion, The predators always came down from the higher elevations during severe storms, drawn by the promise of easy prey. Finn's hand instinctively moved to the bear spray on his belt. He'd never had to use it, but tonight felt like a night of firsts. 10 minutes into his trek, the first real complication arose. His boots, usually reliable in any weather, began to slip on what felt like solid ground. Finn swung his flashlight down, revealing a sheet of black ice beneath the fresh snow. His heart rate quickened. If the road was icing over this badly, Iris's car wouldn't be the only vehicle in trouble tonight. The satellite phone in his pocket vibrated. A text from Luna. "Power's out across the valley, lines down on Highway 23. Be careful, Finn. The mountain's angry tonight." He wanted to respond, to let her know about Iris, but his fingers were already too numb to manage the tiny buttons. 20 minutes in, the second complication made itself known. The wind changed direction suddenly, bringing with it not just snow but tiny particles of ice that stung like needles against any exposed skin. Finn pulled his scarf higher, but the ice somehow found its way through every gap in his clothing. Worse, the change in wind direction meant the tracks he'd been leaving were already disappearing. If he had to turn back. A sound cut through the storm's roar, metal groaning against metal somewhere ahead in the darkness. Finn picked up his pace, ignoring the protest of muscles already stiffening from cold. The beam of his flashlight caught something reflective, a license plate, half buried in snow. The car had skidded completely off the road, its front end wedged into a snowbank, while its back wheels hung precariously over the drainage ditch that ran alongside Pine Ridge Road. It was a newer model Mercedes, sleek and entirely unsuited for mountain conditions. But what made Finn's stomach drop was the angle of the car. It was balanced on the edge of the ditch, and the continuing snowfall was slowly shifting its weight. As he approached, his experienced eye took in the details. The front tire was blown, probably from hitting the drainage ditch's concrete edge. The engine compartment was compressed, suggesting a harder impact than Iris had described. And most worryingly, there was a thin trail of fluid leading from under the car to the snow below, either oil or antifreeze, neither of which was a good sign. Finn reached for the door handle, his gloved hand slipping on the frozen metal. The interior was dark and already filling with snow through the partially open window. He swept his flashlight across the inside. A designer handbag in the passenger seat, a stack of papers scattered across the back seat, and there, in the center console, a prescription bottle with Iris's name. The wind chose that moment to gust particularly hard, and the car shifted with a groan that sent Finn stumbling backward. The Mercedes settled again, but now it was listing even more toward the ditch. Getting it out would be far more complicated than a simple jump start or tow. His radio crackled to life. Multiple transformers down throughout the valley. Emergency services reporting complete whiteout conditions on all major roads. Residents are warned that power restoration may take up to 48 hours. Finn's mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. The car wasn't safe to recover in these conditions, not without proper equipment and better visibility. But Iris's medication was inside, along with any other supplies she might need. He had to at least try to reach it. Bracing himself against the wind, he edged closer to the driver's side door. The car groaned again, a deep metallic sound that warned of imminent movement. Finn had exactly one chance to get this right. He pulled the door handle, but it was frozen shut. Of course it was. Nothing could be simple tonight. Using his elbow, he struck the door frame sharply, trying to break the ice seal around the door. The impact sent vibrations through the entire car, and for one heart-stopping moment he thought he'd miscalculated. But the door cracked open just enough for him to wedge his fingers in. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Finn pulled the door wider, two things occurred simultaneously. He spotted Iris's medication in the center console, and he heard a sound from beneath the car that every mechanic dreads. The distinctive crack of metal giving way under stress. The Mercedes shifted again, more dramatically this time. Finn had a split second to make a decision. He lunged forward, arm outstretched toward the medication, as the car began to slide toward the ditch. His fingers closed around the bottle just as the vehicle's weight shifted fully onto its back wheels. Finn threw himself backward, rolling away from the car. The Mercedes teetered for a moment on the edge of the ditch, then fell with a crash that was mostly muffled by the snow. The impact sent a shower of ice and debris into the air, and Finn felt something sharp graze his cheek as he scrambled to get clear. When the chaos settled, he found himself sitting in the snow, heart pounding, clutching Iris's medication bottle in one hand and his flashlight in the other. The Mercedes lay on its side in the ditch, half buried in snow, its front end crumpled against the concrete drainage wall. Getting it out would now require a full recovery team, and in this weather that meant waiting until morning at best. Blood trickled down his cheek from where the debris had caught him, freezing almost instantly in the brutal cold. But Finn barely noticed the pain. His attention was fixed on something else. Tracks in the snow, partially filled in but still visible. They weren't human tracks. The mountain lion's cry echoed again, closer this time, much closer. And now Finn understood what had really happened to Iris's car. She hadn't just hit a patch of ice, she'd swerved to avoid something on the road, something large and predatory, and still very much in the area. The wind died for just a moment, and in that brief silence Finn heard the soft crunch of paws on snow, somewhere in the darkness behind him. The soft crunch of snow behind him grew closer, and Finn's mind raced through everything he knew about mountain lion encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big. Fight back if attacked. But all that conventional wisdom assumed you could actually see the predator. In this blizzard, with visibility near zero, those rules felt about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. Then, through some miracle of timing or fate, his flashlight beam caught a pair of reflective eyes in the darkness. The mountain lion stood less than 30 yards away, its tawny coat almost invisible against the swirling snow. It was massive, easily 200 pounds of pure muscle and predatory intent. And it was watching him with the focused attention of an apex predator that had found its next meal. But in that frozen moment of terror, Finn's mind made an unexpected connection. The beast's presence explained everything. Iris's sudden swerve, the true cause of the accident, her panic and confusion. More importantly, it explained why she'd been so lucky to find his shop. She hadn't been walking aimlessly in the storm. She'd been following the only safe path available. Mountain lions were territorial, and they rarely strayed far from their established hunting grounds. This one had likely been pushed down from the higher elevations by the storm, following the natural corridor that ran parallel to Pine Ridge Road. The same corridor that led directly to the old service road, Finn breathed, the words forming ice crystals in the air. Uncle Reed had shown him that narrow track years ago, a remnant from the days when the power company needed access to the valley's electrical infrastructure. It ran behind his shop, connecting to Pine Ridge Road at almost exactly the spot where Iris's car had gone off the road. In her panic and confusion, she'd unknowingly followed the safest possible route to help. The mountain lion took a step forward, its massive paw leaving a perfect print in the fresh snow. Finn's hand tightened on the bear spray, but his mind was already racing ahead, seeing possibilities where moments ago there had been only danger. The service road was narrower than Pine Ridge Road, but it was also better protected from the wind by a natural ridge formation. More importantly, it was maintained, however minimally, by the power company. Another step from the predator, another crucial realization. The service road would be free of the black ice that made Pine Ridge Road so treacherous. Its gravel surface and lower elevation meant better drainage and less freezing. If he could reach it, he'd have a much safer route back to the shop. The mountain lion's muscles tensed, preparing to pounce. In that split second before chaos erupted, Finn's free hand found the emergency flare in his pocket. The big cat leaped just as Finn struck the flare against his leg, igniting it with a burst of searing red light that turned the swirling snow into a crimson blizzard. The sudden illumination caught the mountain lion mid-jump, disrupting its attack. The animal landed short, confused by the unexpected fire and light. Finn took advantage of its hesitation, making himself as large as possible while waving the flare in wide arcs. The predator backed away, its instinctive fear of fire overriding its hunger. But Finn knew the respite would be temporary. The flare would burn for maybe 15 minutes, and he was still a good quarter-mile from his shop. The service road offered his best chance, not just of survival, but of turning this night's cascade of disasters into something meaningful. As if to confirm his thoughts, the satellite phone in his pocket vibrated again. This time, he managed to pull it out with numb fingers. Another message from Luna. Power crews using old service road to reach downed lines. Road's been plowed. Be careful, but be smart. The mountain lion paced at the edge of the flare's light, unwilling to approach but equally unwilling to abandon its prey. Finn began moving laterally, keeping the flare between himself and the predator, while working his way toward where he knew the service road began. Each step had to be carefully measured. Too fast would trigger the cat's chase instinct. Too slow would let the flare burn out before he reached safety. His mind wandered briefly to Iris, waiting back at the shop. She'd trusted him, a stranger, with her safety. Now he understood that trust had gone both ways. Her instincts had led her to exactly the right place, exactly when someone was there to help. It wasn't just coincidence. It was the kind of synchronicity that happened when people followed their deepest intuitions. The wind shifted again, driving snow and ice horizontally across the landscape. But this time, Finn recognized it as an advantage. The swirling white created a natural screen between him and the predator, making it harder for the cat to track his movements. He angled his path more directly toward the service road, using the storm as cover. His boots found different terrain, gravel instead of asphalt. He'd reached the service road. The mountain lion's shadowy form disappeared and reappeared through the snow, but its movements seemed less certain now. It was losing the advantage of familiar hunting ground. Then, through the howling wind, Finn heard it, the distant rumble of heavy machinery. The power company crews were indeed using the service road, their equipment creating a path through the deepening snow. More importantly, they were heading in his direction. The mountain lion heard it too. The big cat's ears flattened against its skull, and with one final frustrated growl, it turned and melted into the darkness. Finn didn't lower the flare until the animal's tracks were completely obscured by fresh snow. Standing there in the swirling storm, medication bottle secure in his pocket, and the service road stretching before him like a lifeline, Finn felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival or professional duty. This night had forced him to rely not just on his skills and knowledge, but on something deeper, the ability to find opportunity in crisis, to trust in the hidden patterns that connected people and events. The flare's light began to fade, but ahead, Finn could see the approaching headlights of the power company trucks. He'd found not just a way back to safety, but a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous moments contained their own solutions, if you were brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough to see them. His cheek still stung where the debris had caught him, and every muscle in his body ached from cold and tension. But as he began walking toward the approaching lights, Finn felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He'd come out here to save someone else, only to discover that the real opportunity had been about saving himself. From isolation, from routine, from the comfortable numbness he'd built around his life. The service road stretched ahead of him, a path born of necessity that had become something more, a connection between past and present, between danger and safety, between two people whose lives had intersected at exactly the right moment. And somehow, Finn knew that this hidden road would lead to more than just physical shelter from the storm. The power company's trucks created a protective convoy around Finn as they made their way back toward the shop, their heavy chains and plows clearing a path through the deepening snow. In the relative safety of their wake, his mind turned to Iris, waiting alone in the darkened workshop. The medication bottle felt heavy in his pocket, a small victory against the night's cascade of challenges. When the familiar outline of Hawthorne Motors emerged from the storm, Finn's heart skipped a beat. The emergency lights were still on, casting their warm glow through the windows like a beacon. But something else caught his attention, movement inside, a shadow passing back and forth with purpose and energy. Iris wasn't just waiting, she was doing something. He thanked the power crew foreman, who simply nodded with the unspoken understanding of mountain folk who knew the value of helping each other. As Finn approached the shop's entrance, he could hear the faint sound of machinery running. Not the generator, but something else. Something familiar. The door opened before he could reach for it, and warm air rushed out to meet him. Iris stood in the doorway, her earlier fear replaced by a look of focused determination. She'd shed her expensive coat, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back practically, but it was what lay behind her that made Finn stop in his tracks. The workshop had been transformed. Tools were organized with military precision on the benches. The 3 cars he'd been working on had their hoods up, and beside each one was a notepad with detailed observations written in elegant, precise handwriting. The small coffee maker in the break room was burbling cheerfully, and the entire space smelled of fresh coffee and the industrial cleaner he used on particularly stubborn grease stains. "I hope you don't mind," Iris said, pulling him inside and closing the door against the storm. "I couldn't just sit and worry, and your organization system is remarkably similar to what I used in my research lab." She paused, noticing his frozen expression. "I should explain. Before I retired, I was a mechanical engineering professor at MIT. Finn felt the last pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Her expensive car with its perfectly maintained engine, the way she'd described the mechanical failure with such precision, her calm analysis even in the midst of crisis. She hadn't been a helpless victim of circumstance. She'd been a professional assessing a dangerous situation with trained eyes. "The timing belt on Mrs. Thompson's Subaru," Iris continued, leading him to the first car. "You were right about the wear pattern, but look at this." She pointed to a spot he'd been struggling to properly examine earlier. "The pulley alignment is off by about 2 degrees. That's what's causing the unusual wear." Finn brushed snow from his coat, still processing this revelation. "You could tell that just by looking?" A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I wrote my doctoral thesis on rotational dynamics in automotive applications. Some habits never die." She paused, really looking at him for the first time since his return. "You're bleeding." Her hand reached up toward the cut on his cheek, then hesitated, caught between professional distance and genuine concern. Finn made the decision for her, stepping into the warm light of the shop's emergency lamps. "It's nothing, but your car. I'm sorry, Ms. Winters, it's not good news." As he explained what had happened, the mountain lion, the ditch, the final crash, Iris listened with the same analytical focus she'd applied to his repair jobs. But when he mentioned the predator, something flickered across her face. I wasn't sure what I'd seen. It happened so fast, and then when no one else was on the road. She took a deep breath. "I started to think I'd imagined it, that the stress and the storm had made me see things." "You didn't imagine it," Finn assured her, pulling the medication bottle from his pocket. "Your instincts were right. About everything." He handed her the bottle, and their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange. A small moment, but one that seemed to shift the air between them. Iris studied the bottle, then looked up at him with eyes that held both gratitude and something deeper, understanding. "You risked your life for this. For a stranger." "You're not exactly a stranger anymore," Finn said, gesturing at his meticulously organized workshop. "I think you've left your mark on this place already." She laughed softly, the sound warming the space between them. "Force of habit. When I'm nervous or worried, I organize things. My students used to joke that they could tell how challenging a project was by how clean my lab became." Her expression grew thoughtful. "I haven't been in a proper workshop in years, not since I retired, but being here, seeing all this." She ran her hand along the edge of a toolbox. "It feels like coming home." Moving to the coffee maker, she poured 2 cups with the ease of someone who'd spent countless hours in similar spaces. "Black, right? I noticed you didn't have any cream or sugar out." She handed him a cup, and Finn accepted it with a nod of thanks, surprised by how easily she'd read his preferences. "Why did you retire?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "You obviously still love the work." Iris leaned against the workbench, cradling her own cup. "That's complicated. The short answer is that the university wanted me to focus more on publishing papers and less on teaching. The longer answer. She paused, taking a sip of coffee. I watched too many brilliant young mechanics get pushed toward theoretical research when their real talent lay in practical applications, in making things work, in solving real problems for real people. Her gaze swept across the workshop, taking in the carefully maintained tools, the detailed service records, the evidence of a life dedicated to practical excellence. Places like this, people like you, this is where the real work happens. But academia, she shook her head. They've forgotten that. Finn found himself nodding, understanding perfectly. It was the same reason he'd chosen to stay in Everbrook Valley when larger shops in bigger cities had tried to recruit him. Here, his work made a direct difference in people's lives. Here, every repair was personal. The Martinez family's minivan, he said, gesturing to one of the vehicles. Their daughter's heading to college next week, first in the family. Those brake pads aren't just about safety, they're about making sure a dream stays on track. Iris's eyes lit up with recognition. That's exactly it. That's what I tried to teach my students, that engineering isn't just about calculations and theories. It's about people, about understanding that every machine we work on is part of someone's story. They fell into a comfortable silence, sipping coffee as the storm raged outside. The emergency lights cast a warm glow over the workshop, creating an intimate atmosphere that made the rest of the world feel very far away. In that moment, the age difference between them seemed meaningless. They were simply two people who understood the poetry and precision, the artistry and mechanics, the deep satisfaction of solving problems that mattered. This is probably not how you plan to spend your night, Finn said finally, a hint of humor in his voice. Iris smiled, and this time it reached all the way to her eyes. No, it wasn't. But sometimes the best moments in life are the ones we don't plan for. She set down her coffee cup and picked up the notepad where she'd been writing her observations. Now about that pulley alignment. As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of relenting, Finn found himself experiencing a strange sense of displacement. The workshop, his sanctuary for so many years, felt different with Iris there. Not invaded or disrupted, but transformed, as if her presence had shifted something fundamental in the space he thought he knew so well. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, moving between the three vehicles that needed attention before morning. Iris's expertise complemented his own in unexpected ways. Where he relied on instinct and experience, she brought theoretical knowledge that filled gaps he hadn't even known existed. Together, they'd already solved the pulley alignment issue that had been plaguing him for hours. "Hand me the torque wrench?" Iris asked, her head still buried in the engine compartment of the Martinez family's minivan. Finn reached for it automatically, then paused, struck by the casual familiarity of the moment. How many times had he wished for someone who truly understood this work, who could share not just the labor but the satisfaction of a problem well solved? "You're thinking too loud," Iris said, emerging from under the hood with a smudge of grease on her cheek. The sight of the distinguished former professor with engine oil on her face did something unexpected to Finn's heart. "Want to share what's on your mind?" Finn leaned against the workbench, turning the wrench over in his hands. "I've been doing this job for 14 years, he said slowly. "Done everything I can to keep people safe on these mountain roads. But tonight," he gestured at the organized chaos around them, "tonight feels different." Iris wiped her hands on a shop rag, studying him with those perceptive eyes. "Different how?" "Like maybe I've been fixing the wrong things." The words came out before he could filter them, carrying more truth than he'd intended to reveal. "Cars are straightforward. They follow rules. If something's broken, you can identify the problem, replace the part, restore function. People..." He trailed off, uncomfortable with the vulnerability in his voice. "People are messier," Iris finished for him. She set down the rag and moved closer, her presence both comforting and unsettling. "But sometimes, Finn, the messiest problems lead to the most important solutions." The generator hummed in the background, a steady counterpoint to the storm's chaos. Through the windows, the snow continued its relentless dance, but inside, time seemed to move differently. Finn found himself sharing things he'd never voiced aloud before. When my father left, he said, focusing on a point just past Iris's shoulder, he took more than just himself. He took my mother's trust, my belief in permanence, even my teenage dreams of playing baseball professionally. Uncle Reed saved me by teaching me this trade, but sometimes I wonder, if you're hiding in here? Iris's voice was gentle but unflinching. Using these machines as a shield against the unpredictability of human connection? The accuracy of her assessment should have made him defensive. Instead, Finn felt something crack open inside his chest, a wall he hadn't even known he'd built. "How do you do that?" he asked. "See right through people's defenses?" Iris smiled, but there was a shadow of old pain in her eyes. "Because I spent 20 years doing the exact same thing in my lab. Excellence can be a wonderful shield. Expertise can justify any amount of isolation. Until one day." She traced a finger along the edge of the workbench. "Until one day you realize that all your academic achievements, all your perfectly solved problems, don't keep you warm at night." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding. Outside, the wind changed direction, making the old building creak and settle. Finn watched as Iris unconsciously squared her shoulders against the sound, a gesture so familiar it made his throat tight. How many times had he done the same thing, bracing himself against more than just the physical storm? "Why did you really come up here?" he asked quietly. "To the mountains, in winter, alone?" Iris was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still tracing patterns on the workbench. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a truth long held back. "My wife died 3 years ago." The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. "Cancer. It was quick, at least by medical standards, but long enough for me to watch the most brilliant electrical engineer I'd ever known forget how to work a light switch." She took a shaky breath, and Finn fought the urge to reach for her. "After she died, I threw myself into work, teaching, research, publishing, anything to keep moving. But this year, when the holidays approached," she gestured vaguely at the storm outside, "I couldn't face another Christmas surrounded by memories and well-meaning colleagues. So I got in my car and drove, with some vague idea about finding a quiet mountain lodge where I could be anonymously alone. Instead, you found a broken-down mechanic's shop," Finn said, trying to lighten the moment. "No," Iris corrected him, meeting his eyes directly. "I found exactly what I didn't know I was looking for. A place where things get fixed, where broken pieces are made whole again." The double meaning in her words wasn't lost on either of them. Finn felt something shift in his chest, like an engine finally catching after months of missed timing. All these years, he'd thought he was hiding in his work, using mechanical precision as a substitute for human connection. But maybe he'd been preparing instead, learning the patience, attention, and care needed to repair more than just machines. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" he said, surprised by the roughness in his voice. "Both of us running from connection. Both of us ending up here on the worst night of the year." "Maybe that's not coincidence," Iris suggested. "Maybe sometimes we need to be caught in a storm to find shelter we didn't know we were seeking." The metaphor hung between them, rich with possibility. Finn looked around his workshop, at the organized tools, the half-finished repairs, the evidence of 2 lifetimes spent mastering the art of fixing broken things. For the first time, he saw it not as a refuge from life, but as a workshop for living itself. "The storm's not letting up," he observed, more to ground himself than anything else. "No," Iris agreed, a new warmth in her voice. "But I'm finding I mind that less and less." In that moment, surrounded by the familiar tools of his trade and the unexpected presence of someone who truly understood, Finn felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The sensation of his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, not in fear or pain, but in recognition of their growing obsolescence. The first warning came as a subtle change in the generator's steady hum, a slight fluctuation in pitch that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Finn wasn't most people, and the sound made him straighten up immediately from the brake assembly he'd been working on. Iris, who had been making notes about the Martinez family's minivan, caught his expression and set down her pen. "What is it?" she asked. But before Finn could answer, the generator's rhythm faltered again, more pronounced this time. He was already moving toward the back of the shop, his steps quick and purposeful. "No, no, no," he muttered, throwing open the access door to the generator room. The bitter cold that rushed in carried with it a worrying smell, the sharp, distinctive odor of burning electrical components. Iris appeared beside him, her expertise immediately evident in the way she assessed the situation. "The regulator's failing," she said, not a question but a grim observation. "The cold must have—" The rest of her sentence was lost as the generator gave a final, protesting whine before dying completely. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the workshop into absolute darkness. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and their own breathing. Finn's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the generator. Years of maintaining engines had taught him to read mechanical failures like a doctor reading symptoms, and what he saw made his stomach sink. The voltage regulator hadn't just failed, it had catastrophically overloaded, taking several critical components with it. "How bad?" Iris asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Bad," Finn confirmed, his breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. "The spare parts I need are in my storage unit across town." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he rarely allowed himself. "Without power, the shop's temperature is going to drop fast. The heaters, the equipment, everything, it's all down." The implications hung heavy in the frigid air. Without power, without heat, the workshop would quickly become as cold as the world outside. The vehicles they'd been working on would be impossible to finish. Worse, the medications they'd risked so much to retrieve needed to be kept at room temperature. Iris's voice came through the darkness, steady but concerned. "What about your house? You mentioned living nearby." "My cabin's up on Evergreen Trail," Finn said, already calculating distances and risks. But with the storm this bad, he didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what the mountain was capable of on a night like this. The beam of his flashlight caught Iris's face, and he saw something there that made his chest tighten. Not fear exactly, but a deep, weary resignation. "It's my fault," she said quietly. "If I hadn't been so impulsive, so determined to run away from my problems." "Don't," Finn cut her off more sharply than he'd intended. "This isn't about fault, this is about—" The rest of his sentence was drowned out by an ominous crack from overhead, followed by a sound that every mountain resident dreaded, the distinctive snap of a tree giving way under the weight of ice and snow. They moved instinctively away from the windows, just as the massive pine tree came down, its branches scraping against the workshop's roof with a sound like skeletal fingers. The impact shook the entire building, and somewhere in the darkness, something heavy crashed to the floor. Finn's flashlight beam revealed the damage. One of his toolboxes had fallen, spilling its contents across the floor. But it was what he saw beyond the immediate mess that made his blood run cold. A spiderweb of cracks had appeared in the workshop's front windows, the glass holding for now but clearly compromised. "We can't stay here," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "If those windows give way—" He didn't need to explain what would happen if the bitter cold had direct access to the shop's interior. They'd already lost the protection of the heating system. A broken window would make the space completely uninhabitable. Iris moved through the darkness with surprising sureness, gathering their scattered belongings. "Your cabin," she said firmly. "It's our best option." But Finn stood frozen, his flashlight beam fixed on the wall of photographs he'd accumulated over the years. Each one represented a moment, a connection, a piece of the life he'd built here. The thought of leaving them, of leaving this space vulnerable to the storm's fury, felt like a physical pain in his chest. "Finn." Iris's voice cut through his paralysis. She stood before him now, her face half illuminated by the reflected flashlight beam. "I understand. Believe me, I understand what it means to leave a sanctuary behind. But sometimes—" She reached out and took his free hand, her fingers cold but steady. "Sometimes holding on too tightly to what we're afraid to lose keeps us from finding what we need most." The words hit him like a physical blow, carrying echoes of all the times he'd chosen the safety of his workshop over the uncertainty of the outside world. How many connections had he missed? How many possibilities had he let slip away, all in the name of protecting this carefully constructed fortress of solitude? Another crack from above made the decision for them. This time, the sound was accompanied by a distinct shift in the building's structure, the kind of movement that suggested something fundamental had been compromised. "We need to hurry," Iris said, already moving toward her coat. "The temperature's dropping fast, and if the road to your cabin is anything like Pine Ridge..." Finn forced himself into action, years of emergency preparedness taking over. He quickly gathered essential supplies: blankets, his satellite phone, emergency rations, basic tools. Each item he grabbed felt like an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that his sanctuary was no longer safe. The irony wasn't lost on him. Earlier this night, he'd left the safety of his shop to save Iris. Now she was, in her own way, saving him, forcing him to abandon the very walls he'd built to protect himself from the world. As they prepared to step out into the storm, Finn caught a final glimpse of his workshop in the flashlight's beam. The space that had been his whole world for so long suddenly seemed smaller, more fragile. The carefully organized tools, the half-finished repairs, the collected memories on the walls, all of it reduced to shadows and uncertainty. "Ready?" Iris asked, her voice carrying a strength he desperately needed in that moment. Finn took one last look at his sanctuary, then squared his shoulders against what was to come. "Ready," he replied, though his voice caught slightly on the word. "But Iris?" He turned to face her fully. "Whatever happens out there, thank you for making me see what I've been hiding from all these years." The flash of understanding that passed between them in that moment was more warming than any heater. Then, without further hesitation, they stepped out into the howling darkness, leaving behind the shelter of familiar walls for the uncertain promise of something new. Stepping into the storm felt like entering another world entirely. The wind hit them with physical force, driving snow and ice horizontally across their path. Finn's flashlight beam seemed to bounce off the wall of white, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made it difficult to maintain any sense of direction. But he knew these mountains, knew every turn and slope of the land, even if he couldn't see them. "Stay close," he called to Iris over the wind's howl. She was right beside him, one hand gripping his arm, the other clutching the bag containing her medication and their emergency supplies. The cold was immediate and brutal, seeming to seek out every gap in their clothing with predatory precision. Under normal conditions, the walk to his cabin would take maybe 20 minutes. But these conditions were far from normal. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind seemed determined to push them back with every step. Yet as they struggled forward, Finn found himself experiencing a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, he was moving away from his workshop instead of toward it. The realization hit him with unexpected force. How many times had he used that building as an excuse to avoid real connection, real life? Even his apartment above the local hardware store had been temporary, a way to stay close to work without fully committing to putting down roots. "You're thinking too loud again," Iris shouted over the storm, her voice carrying a hint of amusement despite their dire situation. She stumbled slightly, and Finn's arm went around her automatically, steadying her. The gesture felt natural, necessary, a physical manifestation of the trust that had grown between them over the course of this extraordinary night. They reached the turn onto Evergreen Trail, marked by an ancient oak tree that had survived countless storms. The path ahead would be steeper, but also more sheltered thanks to the dense pine forest that lined both sides of the road. As they passed under the canopy of snow-laden branches, the wind's fury diminished slightly, allowing them to catch their breath. "Tell me about your cabin," Iris said as they walked, her voice steadier now in the relative calm. "I need something to focus on besides how cold my feet are." Finn found himself smiling despite everything. "It's nothing special. Just a small place I inherited from my grandfather. I've been fixing it up slowly over the years, but..." He paused, realizing something. "I guess I never really made it a home. Always told myself I was too busy, that the workshop needed me more." "And now?" Iris prompted gently. "Now." Finn helped her over a fallen branch, taking the moment to gather his thoughts. "Now I'm wondering if maybe I've been looking at everything backward. using broken things as an excuse not to fix what really matters. The wind caught Iris's laugh and carried it away. But her eyes, visible in the flashlight's glow, held understanding. It's funny, isn't it? How we convince ourselves that our walls are actually foundations. I did the same thing with my research after Sarah died. Turned my grief into academic papers, my loneliness into lecture notes. They walked in silence for a moment, each lost in thought. The snow continued to fall, but it felt different now. Less threatening, more like a blanket drawing them closer together. Ahead, through the trees, Finn caught a glimpse of his cabin's dark outline. "Almost there," he said. But as they approached, something made him slow his steps. The cabin stood silent and dark against the storm, yet it seemed different somehow. Perhaps it was seeing it through Iris's eyes, or perhaps it was the night's events shifting his perspective. But suddenly he saw it for what it was. Not just a shelter, but a possibility. The porch light he'd left on was dark, confirming that the power outage affected this area too. But as they climbed the snow-covered steps, Finn felt a surge of something that took him a moment to identify as hope. He knew every inch of this place, every creaky floorboard and drafty window. He knew exactly what needed fixing, what needed updating, what needed love. Inside, the cabin was cold, but not frozen. Finn moved with practiced efficiency, lighting the wood stove while Iris used their flashlights to survey the space. The main room was simple: a worn couch, a small kitchen area, bookshelves filled with repair manuals, and the classic novels his grandfather had loved. But there were also signs of the life Finn had been unconsciously building here: half-finished renovation projects, carefully restored antique tools displayed on the walls, a collection of local photographs he'd taken but never framed. As warmth began to seep back into the space, Finn watched Iris moving through his cabin. She ran her fingers along the spines of books, examined the tools on the walls, studied the photographs with genuine interest. In the soft glow of their emergency lights, he saw his space through new eyes, not as a backup plan or a temporary shelter, but as a canvas waiting for color, a story waiting to be written. "You know," Iris said, turning to face him, "in engineering we talk about structural integrity, how every part of a system needs to work together for the whole to function properly." She gestured around the cabin. "This place has good bones, Finn. It just needs someone to believe in its potential." The double meaning in her words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Finn moved to the wood stove, adding another log more to have something to do with his hands than out of necessity. "I always thought potential was about what something could become," he said carefully. "But maybe it's really about accepting what already is, and having the courage to build from there." Iris stepped closer, her presence warming him more than the fire. "When Sarah was dying," she said softly, "she made me promise not to hide away in my grief. Life is too short for safe distances," she told me. I thought I was keeping that promise by staying busy, by continuing her work. But really, I was just finding new ways to keep my walls up. The wood in the stove crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but in here, in this space that had waited so patiently for its moment, something was shifting. The air felt charged with possibility, with the kind of potential that exists in the moment before dawn. "We should check your medication," Finn said, more to ground himself than anything else. "Make sure it didn't get too cold during the walk." But as he reached for the bag, Iris caught his hand. Her fingers were warm now, steady and sure. "The medication can wait," she said. "Right now, I think we both need to sit with this moment, with the realization that sometimes losing our shelter leads us to find our way home." In the soft light of the emergency lantern, with the storm raging outside and warmth slowly returning to his grandfather's cabin, Finn felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumbling. Here, in this space he'd never fully claimed, with this woman he'd never expected to meet, he was finally understanding what Uncle Reed had tried to tell him years ago: that some things couldn't be fixed with tools and spare parts. Some things needed to break completely before they could be rebuilt into something stronger, something truer. The night was far from over, and morning seemed a distant promise. But as Finn looked around his cabin, really looked at it for perhaps the first time, he realized that sometimes the darkest moments could lead to the brightest discoveries. Sometimes it took losing everything you thought you needed to find everything you never knew you wanted. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin's frosted windows, painting the room in soft shades of gray and blue. Finn stood at the window, watching as the storm finally began to lose its fury. The wood stove's warmth had transformed the cabin into a cozy haven, but his mind was back at the workshop, wondering what damage the night had wrought. "The snow's letting up," Iris observed, joining him at the window. She handed him a cup of coffee. They'd found his old camping percolator and put it to good use. In the growing light, he could see the shadows under her eyes, evidence of their sleepless night. But there was something else there too. A clarity, a certainty that hadn't been present before. "I need to check on the shop," Finn said, his voice rough with worry. "The Martinez family will be coming for their car and Mrs. Thompson's Subaru." "We'll check on it together," Iris interrupted gently. "But first, there's something I need to say." She set her coffee down and turned to face him fully. "Last night, when you went out into that storm to save my medication, you didn't just risk your life for a stranger. You showed me something I'd forgotten existed." Finn felt his chest tighten at the intensity in her voice. "What's that?" "That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone else see our broken pieces." She gestured around the cabin. "Look at this place, Finn. You've been slowly rebuilding it, piece by piece, just like you rebuild engines. But you've been doing it alone, telling yourself that's easier, safer." The truth of her words hit him with unexpected force. Every unfinished project in the cabin, every repair he'd put off at the workshop, they weren't just tasks waiting to be completed. They were opportunities for connection he'd been too afraid to embrace. "I've been thinking," Iris continued, her voice taking on the precise tone she probably used in her lecture. "Halls. The university has been after me to consider a visiting professor position, something part-time, flexible. I always said no because it would mean leaving Boston, leaving the familiar." She paused, meeting his eyes. "But there's a community college in the valley that's been trying to start a technical program. They need someone who understands both theory and practical application." The implications of what she was saying made Finn's heart race. "Iris, you can't what?" she challenged. "Can't choose to make a change? Can't decide that maybe this storm brought me exactly where I needed to be?" She stepped closer, her presence forcing him to really hear her words. "I'm not suggesting anything dramatic, just possibility. The chance to build something new, something that combines both our strengths." Before Finn could respond, his satellite phone buzzed. The message was from Luna. "Power crews reaching town. Roads being cleared. But workshop looks bad from outside. You might want to get back soon." The news should have sent him rushing out the door. Instead, he found himself really looking at Iris, at the way the morning light caught the silver in her hair, at the strength and vulnerability mixed in her expression. He thought about his workshop, about all the times he'd used it as a shield against real connection. "I need to tell you something," he said slowly. "When Uncle Reed gave me the shop, he said something I didn't understand until now. He said, 'A good mechanic knows how to fix things, but a great one knows when something needs to be completely rebuilt.'" Iris's eyes widened slightly, understanding where he was going. "And which are you?" "I thought I was just a fixer," Finn admitted. "Keeping things running, maintaining the status quo. But last night, watching you in the workshop, seeing how you brought your knowledge and experience to something I thought I had all figured out." He took a deep breath. "Maybe it's time to rebuild, not just the shop, but everything." The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the snow-covered landscape outside. In the distance, they could hear the rumble of snowplows beginning their work. The world was waking up, ready to deal with the storm's aftermath. "The technical program," Finn continued, the ideas forming as he spoke. "It could partner with the shop, real-world experience for students, extra hands during busy seasons, and your theoretical knowledge combined with practical applications." He gestured excitedly, seeing the possibilities unfold. Iris's face lit up with understanding. a bridge between academia and real-world mechanics, teaching the next generation not just how to fix engines, but how to understand them completely. She laughed suddenly. Listen to us planning the future while standing in a half-renovated cabin after the worst storm of the year. Maybe that's exactly when we should be planning it, Finn replied, surprising himself with his certainty. When everything's been stripped down to what really matters. The satellite phone buzzed again, another message from Luna. Don't worry about the shop too much. Community's already organizing to help with repairs. That's what we do here. Also, coffee's ready when you are. Both of you. Finn shook his head, amazed at Luna's seemingly supernatural ability to know everything. But the message triggered another realization. The workshop, he said slowly, it was never really about the building, was it? It was about having a place where I could control everything, where nothing unexpected could happen. And now? Iris prompted, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Now I'm thinking maybe the unexpected isn't something to fear. He turned to face her fully. The shop will need extensive repairs. The cabin needs finishing. The technical program needs building from the ground up. None of it will be easy. Easy is overrated, Iris said, stepping closer. Easy doesn't challenge us. Easy doesn't make us grow. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm from the coffee cup. I've spent 3 years playing it safe, hiding behind academic walls. Maybe it's time we both stopped hiding. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light through the cabin windows. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the valley coming back to life. Plows on the roads, chainsaws dealing with fallen trees, the distant voices of neighbors checking on each other. Finn looked around his grandfather's cabin, seeing not just what it was, but what it could become. Not just a shelter, but a home. Not just a place to hide, but a place to build something new. The workshop would need repairs, yes, but maybe that was fitting too. A chance to rebuild it into something more than just his private sanctuary. So, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were considering. Where do we start? Iris smiled, and in that smile, Finn saw all the possibility, all the challenge, all the adventure that lay ahead. We start, she said, by walking back into town together. And then we start rebuilding. Not just buildings and programs, but lives. Together. The word together hung in the air between them, full of promise and challenge and hope. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world waiting to be rediscovered. Inside, in a cabin that had waited so patiently for its moment, two people who had spent too long hiding behind their expertise found themselves ready to build something entirely new. The walk back into town revealed a world transformed. Everbrook Valley had emerged from the storm changed but unbroken, its residents already out clearing paths, checking on neighbors, and beginning the work of recovery. As Finn and Iris made their way down from the cabin, they could see the community's resilience in action. People sharing generators, clearing fallen trees together, offering hot coffee and warm spaces to those who needed them. When they rounded the final bend and the workshop came into view, Finn felt his breath catch in his throat. The damage was evident. Broken windows, fallen trees, the sign hanging at an awkward angle. But what caught his attention wasn't the destruction. It was the people. Luna was there, directing a group of volunteers like a general commanding troops. The Martinez family had brought their pickup truck loaded with plywood and tools. Even Uncle Reed had made it down from his house, sitting in his truck with the heater running, offering advice and hot coffee to anyone who stopped by. Looks like we're late to our own recovery party, Iris observed, squeezing Finn's hand. Before they could reach the workshop, Luna spotted them and hurried over, her usual knowing smile in place despite the early hour and bitter cold. About time you two showed up, she said, hugging them both as if she'd known Iris for years instead of hours. We've got the windows temporarily covered, and Reed's been keeping everyone organized. Well, trying to anyway. Finn looked around at the scene before him, at the community that had come together to save not just his workshop, but a piece of themselves. Every person there had a story about this shop, about times when it had been their lifeline in a crisis. Now they were returning that support, turning individual gratitude into collective action. "I don't know what to say," he managed, emotion making his voice rough. "Then don't say anything," Luna replied simply. "Just listen." She gestured around them. "Listen to what this place means to people. Listen to what you've built here without even realizing it." The morning sun had fully risen now, making the snow-covered valley glitter like diamonds. The temperature was rising too, promising a day of melting and recovery. Finn watched as Uncle Reed carefully made his way over to them, leaning on his cane but moving with purpose. "So," Reed said, looking between Finn and Iris with shrewd eyes, "Luna tells me you're a mechanical engineering professor." "Retired," Iris corrected, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice now, though possibly considering a change in that status. Reed nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already known. "Funny thing about retirement," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes it's just life's way of clearing the path for something better." He turned to Finn. "The shop needed this, son. You needed this. Sometimes things have to break down completely before they can be rebuilt right." The wisdom in his words struck Finn anew, echoing his own realizations from the night before. He looked at the workshop, not with despair at the damage, but with vision for what it could become. The bare bones were still strong, the foundation solid. Everything else could be rebuilt, improved, transformed. "Actually, Uncle Reed," he said, "we've been talking about some ideas, about combining practical experience with theoretical knowledge, about building something new." As they outlined their vision, the technical program, the partnership with the community college, the expansion of the shop's role in the valley, Reed's smile grew wider. When they finished, he looked at Luna, who was trying and failing to hide her own knowing grin. "Told you," she said to Reed. "Didn't I tell you last week that changes were coming? That's why I had those educational program brochures ready." Finn and Iris exchanged startled looks. "Last week?" Iris asked. "But how?" Luna just winked. "Some things you feel in your bones, like storms coming down from the mountain. Other things you feel in your heart." She looked meaningfully between them. "Now who wants coffee? We've got a lot of work to do." As the morning progressed, more people arrived to help. The broken windows were properly boarded up, the fallen trees cleared away, and plans made for proper repairs. But more than the physical recovery, Finn felt something else being rebuilt. His understanding of what it meant to be part of a community, to be connected to something larger than himself. Iris moved through it all with growing confidence, her expertise and warmth winning over everyone she met. She didn't just offer suggestions for repairs, she saw possibilities that others missed, ways to improve and innovate rather than simply restore. And when she talked about the technical program, her passion ignited similar enthusiasm in others. By midday, the immediate crisis was under control. The shop was secured against further damage, and plans were in place for proper repairs. The Martinez family's minivan had been safely moved to a temporary workspace, and Mrs. Thompson had already called to say she could wait a few days for her Subaru. Standing in what remained of his office, Finn found the old photograph that had caught his attention the night before, the one of his younger self. But now, instead of seeing what he'd lost, he saw what he'd gained. Experience, wisdom, and finally the courage to build something new. "Ready?" Iris asked from the doorway. She'd been talking with Luna about temporary housing options while the cabin renovations were completed. Finn took one last look around the workshop, not with regret or worry, but with appreciation for what it had been and excitement for what it would become. "Ready," he replied, and this time the word felt like a promise rather than a resignation. As they stepped out into the bright winter day, Finn realized that sometimes the greatest acts of healing don't come from fixing what's broken, but from finding the courage to build something entirely new from the pieces. Sometimes it takes a storm to show us that our safest harbors have actually been our greatest limitations. And sometimes, on a cold winter night in a small mountain town, two lives can intersect in ways that change not just themselves, but an entire community. Not through mere coincidence or simple fate, but through the courage to reach out, to trust, to build something stronger than walls and safer than solitude. The story of the young mechanic and the retired professor would be told in Everbrook Valley for years to come, not just as a tale of rescue and romance, but as a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things can emerge from the darkest storms, if only we're brave enough to open our doors when opportunity knocks. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.